Hi, so today we're going to go over chapter 41, discussing reproductive systems. So we covered meiosis, and we covered the whole idea behind meiosis being the very reason, the whole purpose of meiosis in general is for the production of gametes, right? And so once we make those gametes, then of course they're used for reproductive purposes. So sexual reproduction is basically the egg of one parent being fertilized by the sperm of another parent. So essentially gametes will fuse during fertilization, and that will, of course, that fusion brings a lot of genetic variation. So animals produce gametes in gonads, and so those are specialized organs. So males, the testes produce sperm, and ovaries produce eggs. Placental mammals do not lay eggs per se, so what happens instead is that the placenta is created, and that allows nutrients between the mother and the developing embryo to be exchanged. So then the development happens inside the female's body. Essentially, the ovary and the testicular function are regulated by hormones. And so basically those hormones are produced, or the brain is in charge of regulating which hormones get produced. And then the hormones that are produced will regulate testicular and ovarian function. So the testes are the paired gonads that are suspended in the scrotum. The scrotum is, of course, designed to protect the testes. They're susceptible to weather changes, and so, of course, the scrotum will pull those testes in close to the body if it's cold externally, and then, of course, distend to allow those testes to be cooled in the event the body is overheated, so that no sperm cells are damaged. So sperm cells themselves are produced by the testes. They mature in the epididymis and eventually get conducted out of the body through the vas deferens. So the production of sperm happens in the seminiferous tubules, and so they're packed with cells that are undergoing spermatogenesis. And so the spermatogonia divide. Primary spermatocytes will then be produced. Those primary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 1. They produce secondary spermatocytes. Those secondary spermatocytes undergo meiosis 2 and produce spermatids, which will then mature into a mature sperm cell with 3 parts to it. So here's my little image, if you can see, of spermatogenesis. So you get 4 mature sperm cells at the end of spermatogenesis. So the penis itself, if we start focusing on the human male reproductive system, the penis is the cylindrical organ that hangs in front of the scrotum, of course. It has 3 columns of spongy erectile tissue, which fills up with blood, and that stiffens the penis, and that allows for its size to increase during arousal. So here's a cross-section of the penis anatomy. You can see that it does have that erectile tissue that does fill with blood. Sperm cells are actually transported from the body in seminal fluid or semen. And so the sperm cells are actually they're kind of fragile. They're susceptible to heat changes, and they're susceptible to various pH, so they need some protection. So there are glands and vesicles that contribute accessory fluids or seminal fluid to the contribution, so that when sperm cells are leaving the body, they're also accompanied by these accessory fluids, and that helps give the sperm cells some protection. So the seminal vesicles release prostaglandins and fructose-filled secretions. The prostate gland releases secretions. The bulbourethral glands um, basically release pre-ejaculate that cleans the urethra of acidic residue, because think about it, sperm cells and urine have to come out the urethra. So the bulbourethral glands helps with that, deal with that issue. Now, the sperm cells are going to be deposited in a very acidic condition if they're on their way to um, land in the vagina is not so welcoming to unwanted guests. And so what happens is, of course, these additional fluids help protect those sperm cells. So this just shows you a table of the important male reproductive system. So remember I said the brain controls the hormones. So the hypothalamus has ultimate control of testicular function. And so there are several hormones that help regulate or promote spermatogenesis. And even like luteinizing hormone actually controls the production of testosterone, which is then produced in the testes. And of course, testosterone is responsible for a lot of stuff, but of course, it's the major sex hormone in males. And it's responsible for secondary sex characteristics like greater muscle development, increased height, deeper voice, chest hair, face hair, back hair, that kind of thing. So in ovulation, for the female reproductive system, ovulation is a thing that occurs where an oocyte is burst from an ovary and swept into the oviduct or the fallopian tubes by finger-like projections called fimbriae. And so that moves the cilia, the oocyte that's ejected actually gets moved along the lining, moved along that fallopian tube by cilia that lines the fallopian tube. And so fertilization actually normally happens in the fallopian tube or the oviduct. And then once fertilization happens, cilia actually move that developing embryo down to the uterus, where it would embed in the uterine lining, called the outermost uterine lining that's open to implantation, where that embryo would embed, is called the endometrium. So the female reproductive system consists of a little more complexity, because females have to not only make their gametes, then they also have to be responsible for the growth and development of that next generation. So you have, it's kind of a two-part thing where we've got to know what the ovaries are doing for ovulation and oocyte production, but then also we also have to look at the endometrial lining inside the uterus, because that's where a developing embryo and then fetus would then develop. So one of the critical things that I like to cover in this chapter is, of course, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So the ovarian cycle is all about looking at maturing that oocyte until it's ready for ovulation out of the ovary. And so where that happens is inside the ovary, and the ovary will actually create like this follicle, and it's almost like a oocyte little apartment for it to grow and develop. And so the follicle will actually change as the oocyte changes, matures, and gets ready for ovulation. So when ovulation happens, a secondary oocyte will be released from an aged follicle, and it enters the oviduct or the fallopian tubes, and then the follicle will then develop into what's known as a corpus luteum, which degenerate if pregnancy doesn't happen. But if pregnancy does happen, then that corpus luteum is going to be releasing hormones that will maintain the endometrial lining where the developing embryo would embed. So the phases of the ovarian cycle include the follicular phase, where FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, promotes the development of a follicle, which then secretes estrogens, and then the luteal phase promotes the development of the corpus luteum, which then secretes progesterone. So progesterone levels rise, of course, and then uh, eventually, if there's no pregnancy, the corpus luteum degenerates and the menstruation begins. The uterine cycle lines up with the ovarian cycle, and it's very critical that it does that. So the sex hormones that are produced in the ovarian cycle affect the endometrium. So that's huge. It's a huge deal because the endometrium needs to thicken, and um, it needs to thicken in such a way that it can allow the implantation of a developing embryo. So the uterine and ovarian cycles are very much lined up. So the uterine cycle just is a 28-day cycle. So on days 1 through 5, the endometrium disintegrates and menses pass out the vagina through menstruation. Days 6 through 13, the endometrium thickens. And that's because eventually that developing embryo is going to travel down the fallopian tubes and end up in the uterine lining. And so the endometrium is thickening there. Ovulation doesn't even happen until after the endometrium starts thickening up again. Because then on days 15 through 28, the endometrium doubles in thickness and essentially it would permit a developing embryo to embed in that lining, that thick, nutrient-rich lining, because it takes 3 whole months to build and develop a placenta that will eventually feed and provide nutrients to the developing fetus. But at first, that's not built yet. And so there has to be some nutrient rich source. And that endometrium lining is a nutrient rich source for that developing embryo. This is a hugely critical chart because you can see that basically, like, during the initial follicular phase here, we're developing our oocyte. So the endometrium lining is actually shedding right now. But then once you get to the mature follicle, when ovulation is going to happen, if you look, the endometrial lining here is very thick. Progesterone levels increase, even estrogen levels increase just a little, all in preparation for possibly a pregnancy. So, but if pregnancy does not happen, then menstruation will happen. And so the arteries that supply the lining of the uterus constrict, capillaries weaken, the lining detaches, and blood and mucus and degenerating endometrium will descend from the vagina. And of course, that's assisted by an enzyme that prevents the blood from clotting during this process. And you really only have between the ages of 45 to 55 to do it, because between 45 and 55, menstruation actually ceases because the ovaries no longer function. But if fertilization happens, the embryo begins developing as it travels down the uterus. It's going through mitosis over and over and over again, and then it'll become embedded in the uterine lining several days after fertilization. Once that happens, then that embryo will start developing placental cells as well. And so immediately you're starting to see placenta cells. And so essentially the placenta will then, once the placenta is made, even any of the cells are made, it starts producing HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. The HCG hormone maintains the corpus luteum until the placenta itself can take on the job of producing progesterone and estrogen. And that HCG is what's detected in pregnancy tests. So it's not typical. I've seen false negatives, but I haven't seen a ton of false positives. Those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are essential for normal development and function of the female reproductive organs, and also secondary sex characteristics as well, like being a little bit more rounded due to fat accumulation. So if you have a infant, if you have a tiny human, your body, once you give birth, your body will prepare for the possible feeding of said tiny human. And so that is what the female breast is for. Each breast contains 15 to 24 lobules, and they all have their own mammary ducts. So lactation itself is milk production and is caused by the hormone prolactin. Essentially, you don't just have a baby and begin making milk. Like that's just not how it works. At first, you have a baby and you produce colostrum until the milk production begins, and it begins a few days after the delivery of a baby. It's not immediate, but the colostrum is packed full of antibodies and all sorts of healthy stuff that the baby needs, and it'll really kickstart their immune system if they're able to get that colostrum. A very critical, if you're talking about female breasts, it's very critical that women check their breasts for lumps. After skin cancer, breast cancer is the most common type of cancer among women in the United States, so it's important to have mammograms, and you're supposed to get them earlier if you do have a family history of breast cancer. This shows you all those lobules. Inside the breast, there's actually these mammary ducts here actually hold a little storage of milk there. So if your infant latches on, they get kind of an immediate feedback so they know to continue suckling. And then the effort of suckling actually causes that stimulation. Actually, it's a positive feedback loop. So the baby attaches, that tells your body, oh, I need more milk. It sends a signal to your brain to work on continuing to make those hormones that are allowing lactation to continue. And so that's a pretty constant feedback loop there. Like if your baby has a growth spurt and they start cluster feeding, that cluster feeding will tell your brain to make more milk, I gotta do it. So we've learned how the reproductive system works, and we know the reproductive system can also be a contributing factor because of what people do of sexually transmitted infections. And so there are an estimated 20 million new cases of STDs each year. So 1 in 4 college students get infected with one or more of 30 different STD causing organisms. So they can be viruses, bacteria, protists, even arthropods can be an STD. Of course, the most known one is HIV, and HIV can cause AIDS and also lead to cancers. And what it does is attack helper T cells, macrophages, and other cells with CD4 on the surface. And it's transmitted by sexual fluid or blood transfer. And there's no cure for it yet, but there are major advances in antiretrovirals and other treatments that prevent the growth of the virus. And of course, they're still always looking for a vaccine that could end the AIDS epidemic. This shows you a picture of HIV. So another sexually transmitted infection, this one is a virus. We'll go through the viral ones first. It's genital warts. It's from the group of human papilloma viruses, HPVs. Since it is a virus, and there's no cure for genital warts, but it can be treated. You can have them removed and things like that. And you can have genital warts on the penis, the vulva, the vagina, the cervix, and even the anus. Genital herpes is also viral. So you can have type 1, which you get cold sores and fever blisters, or type 2, which actually produces ulcerations on the genitals, breakouts of ulcerations. So you can't get rid of it. If you get herpes, you get herpes. Hepatitis is, or viral hepatitis, you can get from, like, you can get type A. There's Hep A, Hep B, Hep C, Hep D. So Hep A you can get from sewage contaminated drinking water. Hep B you can get from blood transfusions and bodily fluids. Hep C, blood transfer only. HPV, there's over 100 types of HPV, or human papillomaviruses, and there are 10 types that are associated with cancer, and essentially like uterine cancer. So that it can be effectively treated, but the virus can be spread easily to your partner without you knowing it, because it's often asymptomatic. But it is diagnosed by a pap smear. Cervical cancer itself is one of the types of cancers associated with HPV, and there are vaccines available to prevent the infection of HPV and also kind of decrease deaths from this type of cancer. So now we get to bacterial STDs, and those include, of course, chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis. This can all be cured with antibiotics. Some other various sexually transmitted infections include vaginitis, which is vaginal inflammation. There's bacteria, or even growths, or even Candida albicans, where you have like a yeast infection that can be passed on to your partner. Trichomonas, that's a protozoan parasite that can enter either the urethra of the male or the female. Usually if males have trichomonas, it's asymptomatic, but females, it's a little more noticeable. You can use pre-exposure prophylaxis, so that's preemptive use of drugs to prevent disease in people who have not been exposed to the disease yet. They're really looking at that with regards to the HIV virus, but they have to be, they are usually taken by people who are HIV negative, but who have a higher risk. So obviously you always need to seek treatment if you're concerned. You can test at health centers for free generally. And of course it's not shameful. It's very common to get various STDs.